Welcome back. This is Nicole Naditz, and today we're going to do a short lesson based on a couple of documents that I have put in your resources in Canvas. One of them is this infographic, which is actually based on an overview article by Helena Curtin on using the target language and strategies for providing comprehensible input so that we can stay in the target language the majority of the time. So let's get started. In order for language acquisition to occur, learners really have to be surrounded with comprehensible input. It is critical to infuse the environment with the target language. And in order to do that, we really have to ensure that at least 90% of what the students encounter, as well as what the students themselves are doing, is in the target language. So we're going to aim for 90 or 95 or even 100% target language use in our classes. And that is necessary so that language acquisition can take place naturally, kind of the way we all learned our first languages. The other reason that it's really important to use the target language is because it is actually much more motivating to students than using English. Because when we use English, we're sending the message that we don't have confidence that our students will be able to understand this new language or use it themselves. And so if we spend a lot of time in English, not only are we sending a message of a lack of confidence, but we are also denying them the opportunity to have the language experiences that they will need in order to truly be able to communicate in the language. It is especially important that the teacher use the new language for all classroom tasks and for things like giving directions, organizing the activities, and even managing behavior. Because by doing so, we demonstrate that the new language works for real communication. It can be used for the important business of the classroom and therefore of the world beyond the classroom, and that it is not just an academic exercise. But when we do that, we have to make sure that the language we are using is comprehensible to our learners. So there are several important support systems that have to be in place. First of all, support around the curriculum and the program. The curriculum and the program have to be standards-based, proficiency-focused, and they really have to prioritize communication and meaningful messages rather than the completion of textbook-style activities. Secondly, the instruction must focus on meaning rather than grammatical rules. Third, textbooks have to be treated as a tool or a resource rather than the primary source of curriculum. And finally, the classroom must be a learning community that creates a safe environment for risk-taking and making mistakes and sustains that environment. So basically, we want to make sure that the language we are using, the language structures and stems and frames we are teaching our students, and the language that the students themselves are using really is purposeful and contextualized. We want everything to be something that students want and need to learn or to understand. There has to be a communicative intent, and they don't have to understand every word in order for this to be successful. When we make our input comprehensible, it helps students understand that the main points of what the teacher is saying are really the gist of the communication, and the goal becomes understanding the gist, especially for our newest language learners, rather than understanding every single word. So that brings us back to English. As I said earlier, we strive for at least 90% target language use. That does leave a 10% window for using English, but we need to be really strategic about how and when and why we are using English and what that English looks like. So before resorting to English, you want to ask yourselves a few questions. For example, is it possible to try another approach in the target language to communicate that idea? For example, can I maybe add some visual support, add some gestures, use some words that are more similar to English but have the same general meaning in order for my students to understand. Can I maybe substitute a different concept? Maybe it's an extremely important concept in a teachable moment that absolutely cannot be communicated in the target language, but often if that concept was truly important to the students at this point in time, then it can be done in the target language in some way, maybe by modeling, for example, rather than trying to explain. So that becomes, going down to the last point you see on the screen, delay. Maybe it's a topic that they aren't ready for, and that's why you can't communicate it in the target language to them. Maybe it's something we delay until the students have a higher level of proficiency. But one last question to ask yourself before resorting to English is, can you simplify what it is that you are trying to communicate? So ultimately, the real focus becomes making sure that students can understand what it is that the teacher is saying, because we don't want to build frustration. We really want our learners to feel like the language learning experience is something that is working for them and that is valuable to them and that helps them do real things with the language. And as a result, we have a lot of frequently asked questions about using the target language, like, what if the learners don't understand? Will they become resistant? And although it's true that learners sometimes feel insecure because they think they have to know every single word, we can show them at the beginning stages of language learning that it is the gist or essence of the message that is the main goal. And that really helps them overcome that insecurity. It's also really important to break topics into smaller chunks and embed lots of checks for understanding in those chunks. And we're going to talk more about checks for understanding in Module 1, actually. We really want to be sure that we are choosing topics and themes of instruction that are meaningful. So one of the other questions we get is, well, if I use the target language, I'll have to slow down so much that I'm not going to be able to cover all of the curriculum. Covering isn't the goal. It really doesn't matter how much you cover. What's important is what the students actually can do with the information. So often we find that slowing down, using our high leverage teaching practices such as comprehensible target language use, are really the strategies we're going to do to, in the long run, provide the highest possible proficiency ranges for our students. So we also want to use questioning strategies, and they help during the comprehensible input process. So what's happening is, as you're chunking those lessons, like I referred to earlier, you're going to provide opportunities for learners to pause and think and reflect and process that new information before you just power through the rest of the lesson. And there's a sequence to asking those questions that actually builds learner confidence, and it shows them, as well as showing you, that the learners are in fact understanding the lesson right in the moment, and that they are ready for you to continue with that lesson and add the next step. So the sequence for these kinds of questions is to, for example, start with just pointing at something or asking a very directed question, which is usually a yes or no question. So, for example, if you're teaching vocabulary about foods, you might point to the picture of an apple and just ask, is this an apple? And all the students have to say is yes or no. They don't have to yet have mastered the word for apple, but they're showing you that they understand which words go with which pictures. Don't start teaching the next thing yet, because they're not ready. So the next step is to do an either or question. This is going to start to require the learners to use the language in order to show you that they're understanding, but it does it in a way that's easy for them. So using the apple again, you show the picture of the apple, you point to the apple and you say, is this an apple or an orange? And all they have to say is apple. And that shows you that they're understanding, and they are now building comfort with saying this new word themselves. And then the last step in the sequence, and again, we still have not continued the lesson, is to ask another kind of question. So in the case of an apple, you would point to the apple and say, what is this? If it was a preposition lesson talking about things being on or under or next to, you would say, where is the apple? If you're looking at different members of the family, you might ask, who is this? Only after you've gone through that sequence of questions so that your students have had multiple opportunities to process that same small set of new words or phrases or concepts and shown you in 3 different ways that they are in fact understanding it and that they are able to start using and saying the words, then you continue the lesson with the next chunk. And so with that basically brings us to the end of this mini lesson. But if you want more information, remember the entire article, which is much more detailed, is actually located in your resources in Canvas. And this infographic is also located in your resources in Canvas. I look forward to seeing you next time.